Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is 𝗢𝗍𝐿, and with me today is Zandering. Zandering, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I got where I needed to go to make my delivery for the morning. I'm doing good.
Nice. I know it's so. I recently all the shows have been right when you're like dropping stuff off. You spend 90% of your time on the road, and we've just been hitting every show. I'm like, no, I'm dropping it off today. Sorry. It's okay. So excuse me. Really glad to see that now. I got to tell you, you first introduced me to First Amendment, Second Amendment auditors, and at first I was a little kind of like, and I got to tell you, 80 to 90% of all the videos I see, they're looking for trouble. They're not, they strike me as people who are genuinely just like, oh, let's see if I can just tick this cop off. But there were some that were really very interesting, and I learned a lot about it. I know that that's something that you've been interested in, and I know that you and I have talked a lot about policing, and it's a tough thing because there's obviously abuses, but there's also obviously it's work that we have to have done, and it's one of those things. It's just hour upon hour of sheer boredom, followed by seconds of abject terror, and we've also seen dash cam footage of police officers just pulling somebody over, and then somebody just gets out, shoots them, drives off. That definitely happens. So it's a very tough thing, and this country has a difficult relationship with its police and also with guns, which are reasonably ubiquitous in the society. So I've been looking forward to this one. I don't know about you.
Oh yeah, I definitely have, because I've got a pretty big interest in that. I'm amazingly enough, I would talk about being in the military. My primary job in the Navy was as a quartermaster. I was responsible for the safe navigation of the ship. However, I was also a duty master at arms. And had I stayed in the Navy instead of getting out, I would have actually cross-rated. That was in my contract for re-enlistment. I was going to cross-rate to master at arms, because that's what I initially wanted to do, which is the police force of the Navy. So I've been through some of the, at least, Navy police training. And so I've always had an interest in law enforcement. And especially in today's day and age, it's become a very interesting, I've been made aware of a lot more nuanced problems, and have been, on the one hand, impressed with the men and women of law enforcement and dismayed at the same time. So it's a very interesting position I find myself in, going, I see lots of problems and I see lots of bright spots, and I want to get more bright spots and less problems.
Well, for me, whenever I have law enforcement questions, there are two go-tos, and everybody who watches the channel has heard me talk about both of them. One is 𝗍𝗺𝗍, for obvious reasons, former cop in New York, also a prosecutor, an attorney, so he's always an interesting one to talk to. And the second is Pat Lowinger, who is with us today, so let's bring him out. Pat, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Which means Nate wasn't available today, so I'm here.
Oh, you told him. Damn. Shoot. Okay. Yep.
I wasn't supposed to mention that we weren't able to get Nate. I'm sorry. That's my bad.
It's the B roster. This is Pat is not. Pat is definitely not on the B list. Pat is. In fact, Pat, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience in this, and one of the reasons why now your channel is Discovering History with Pat Lowinger, but that is actually not why you're on.
That's not why I'm here. It's the furthest reason from why I'm here today. So prior to becoming, many of you know me as like your happy historian and archaeologist. Prior to that career shift, I was a police officer in Southeast Los Angeles, became a cop in the mid-90s, worked until my retirement in 2012, after which I went back to school and did everything that most people on YouTube know me for. But during that time, I worked a variety of assignments, everything from what we call uniform patrol through specialized assignment. I was part of I worked, what we'd call the gang unit back in the day. I also worked in our training unit. I was both a field training officer, which means I trained young officers. I also did like academy training. In addition to that, I was a firearms and tactical instructor. I was a member of our tactical team, and at one point an element leader of a tactical team. And I've trained a variety of agencies across Southeast LA, Riverside County, San Diego County, worked in Arizona. So I'm familiar with several agencies, even outside of California, some of the rules, regs, and laws and state constitutional issues that you have. So all I can say is I kind of have a well-rounded career. I'm not a specialist in any one area. Maybe on the tactical side of things, I was part of towards the end of my career, I was part of the lethal use of force in our department, our expert team, basically reviewing policy and, how we were going to address a transfer from back then in the 2000s was how are we getting away from like a use of force continuum to a use of force options chart, which was kind of like, do we have to always escalate in a certain way, or can we just jump from, the beginning to the end if we need to? And we looked at policies and training that would address that, in addition to a variety of issues with really what was emerging was mass shooting events. I was part of our active shooter training program for several years and actually had some experience dealing with those scenarios in real time.
So Southeast Los Angeles, that was at the time, even, and probably I think still is, one of the most violent areas in the country, certainly more violent even than Detroit, if I'm not mistaken.
It was busy. We had quite a few homicides in the cities that I worked. I worked in 2 different agencies in that area. But the important thing to remember is I don't think how dense parts of LA can be, I think there's a lot of mischaracterizations of certain cities. When they talk about a city being a small city in Southeast Los Angeles, they're also talking about a city of 250,000 people sometimes. And they're talking about like, well, they've had their 3rd murder this month, or this third, it's the 3rd murder of the year, because they always start at the beginning of the year and count forward. So you'd say, yeah, but this is a city in retrospect that's no more dangerous than Los Angeles, which in many cases is any more dangerous than other cities throughout the world. But during the late 90s, from about 95 to 2000, yeah, we had a major uptick in crime, a lot of gang-related violence, which I was a part of as far as law enforcement.
So we talk a lot about law enforcement. I mean, we do current events. There's always stuff going on with law enforcement. We've seen footage of what appears to be officers stopping someone maybe that they shouldn't have stopped, or this or that. So we always have those discussions. And then people are saying, well, why is the officer just sort of taking a posture that sort of assumes that the person's going to engage violently? And so we talk about these things quite regularly. What are some of the more common misconceptions that the average American has about their expectations of police officers that you think probably not productive?
Well, probably the most important thing is many people think that there aren't reasons for police to contact you that you're not aware of. So a very common one, a scenario we see throughout many YouTube videos, which some of you which you've reviewed, are someone's walking down the street, maybe on their cell phone, and have a cell phone camera, and an officer rolls up to them, and also roll up because that's kind of how they do it, and gets out and say, hey, can you come over here and talk to me? Now they go, hey, the reaction of the citizen, the person that's actually, generating this film, or one of his friends is, or I should say video because they don't use film anymore, is, I'm not doing anything wrong. Well, first of all, you're not aware of what someone may have said when they called dispatch. Again, officers are given a amount of information, and then based on their training experience, they respond and understand that depending on what's said, translating this in real time to officers in the field for the most part. Now, some dispatch centers, you have a 911 operator who then transfers it to dispatch. We can get in all the permutations on how this can be a very bad game of telephone. And in my experience, it is a bad game of telephone sometimes. That officers then are given information on what somebody else, not you, the person that the police are contacting, but someone who is a quote unquote observer or reporting party, has told them. So, for example, if you're just walking down the street, but the person sees you and thinks you're looking into cars to burgle them, may not be aware of that. Now, based on that information, does an officer who hasn't contacted the reporting party yet, by the way, because that's not how law enforcement generally works, do they have a right to stop and detain you to determine whether or not you're actually in the commission of crime? Now, lawyers may say no. Fortunately, the Supreme Court said yes, for the general most part, given that if a reporting party is A, identified, B, based on the information coming in law enforcement officer, it raises the level of reasonable suspicion, does the officer have the right to then contact you and determine? It definitely helps, though, if the officer, when they arrive on scene, sees you doing the suspicious activity, right, associated with whatever the reporting party said. But if you don't know what's going on, my advice to people is generally don't assume you have all the facts that the officer has, because the officer doesn't know what you know. The officer only knows what someone's told him. And don't assume that they said, yeah, this guy's just walking down the street really calm with his two friends. And another thing I've realized is a lot of people don't realize they may have broken the law, and they have. That's another issue. Incidental trespass is a good way to have the police, for example, have a reason to detain you that you don't agree with. And that happens quite often, or minor infractions, but there's still reasons for officers to detain people, like jaywalking. Now, do you have the right to walk away from a police officer if you've jaywalked? The answer is no. You may think you do, but I have the right to stop you and detain you and issue a citation if I need to. And there can be a lot of scenarios where officers will be responding to a scene, reference something else, like, again, the person looking into cars, and then wait for them to commit a actual on-view offense, an infraction, which gives them additional reasons to stop and detain you. So yes, they're actually stopping and detaining you for the suspicion of possibly being a burglar in action or attempted burglary, but now they have a legal justification, right? Again, the same thing with traffic stops. The reason using, for example, the vehicle code was the best way to pull over suspects that you thought were related to other crimes, was you wait for an infraction to occur and you have reason to stop them and detain them for a limited time and conduct an investigation related to both the traffic offense and the suspected activity. And a lot of citizens, regular folks, don't realize that's actually completely legal. It's gone all the way through the Supreme Court. It's been adjudicated at state and the federal level. So that's kind of the standard operating practice of law enforcement now.
Could you tell us the difference between a detainment and a arrest, and what the burden is for each, and what the officer has as powers for each?
Well, I always laugh because this is something you have to explain to typically people who come right out of the academy, because there's the constructive part of it, and then there's the reality. Because so there's constructive detainment, even though if I make you think you're detained, most courts have ruled, then you're detained. If I make you think you're under arrest, or any reasonable person would think you're under arrest, then you're effectively under arrest. Back when I was a cop, those issues typically dealt with, when does Miranda kick in? When you start questioning people. Miranda is not that much of an issue anymore. We can talk about that later. But back when I was a cop, it was still, Miranda was a key issue as far as when you contact people. But a detainment. Detainment means I have the right to restrict your movement in order to conduct a investigation. This court has said that the detainment can't be excessive, but it can be highly restrictive. What does that mean? It means I can put you in handcuffs. I can sit you on the curb. I can actually have you leave your vehicle, but I can't keep you for an inordinate amount of time. And even the restrainment has to be reasonable. So like if I have 5 officers and they're all, for example, all men, and they're all 6'5", and you're a 120-pound female, handcuffs may not actually, that may be a constructive arrest, at least in some situations. So the amount of officer presence, my actions have to be reasonable. If I'm alone, restraints are handcuffs are much more in line with, like our policy where I worked, than would be like if you had several officers and had what we considered a security element there in order to detain a suspect. Arrest is an arrest. It's you're no longer free to go even when I'm done, because I have now probable cause to believe that you've committed the offense of which I was investigating you. So detention based upon the investigation can turn into an arrest without anything changing. You're still in handcuffs because I was detaining you, but at some point I've decided now you're under arrest. And it's not always like the movies, but at some point you basically say, hey, look, get up off the curb. I'm taking you to jail. You're under arrest. And typically that starts a whole different system of legal obligations on the side of law enforcement. So yeah, so it has to do with the limit, like how far we can translocate you. You can't typically translocate detainees. In some weird situations you can, but those are pretty rare. I'll give you an example of when it's sometimes okay to transport a detainee. There is a armed robbery. Suspect matching the description is seen. He's detained by law enforcement. He's not found with a weapon, for example, but weapons disappear. That's just what happens in law enforcement. And the victim of, in this case, typically victims are brought to, or witnesses are brought to the detainee. They put them in a police car, typically we hide them and bring them over and goes, is that the guy, or is that the person you saw rob the liquor store? It's called a field identification or a field show up. Sometimes your victim is the victim of the robbery who may be injured. And so they'll be treated by paramedics and or fire department. In that case, it's okay because of medical necessity to transport the suspect. But then again, you can't be transporting them across town. You can take them a block or two, sometimes a few blocks. But then those are rare exemptions, which have to be highly documented for the reasons why you did it, because those are immediate challenges, because a long detention and transportation is seen as an effective arrest in many cases, or constitutes offense.
Right.
These are all control tactic stuff that you teach young cops who sometimes get it really wrong. I'm just going to say, like, as a field training officer, I held my head daily and just shook it a lot.
All right, Zandering, was there any questions you wanted to ask?
I guess one of the things you did mention, the game of telephone.
Yeah, that's really bad.
Yeah, and the fact that I've seen, with the advent of everybody having a high definition camera and video recorder in their pocket with them almost 24/7, has led to a hell of a lot of video of events happening. And with the, I guess, more ease of FOIA requests to be able to get the information from law enforcement, you can actually get recorded 911 calls of incidences. So there's several, for instance, channels that I follow that are focused on police activity, where they've actually gone and gotten the calls for the video that they have of the interaction with police they've had. So they know what was said to at least the 911 dispatcher versus what was said. And we've come to kind of sort of the conclusion, and I wonder if, I'm not sure how you could verify this.
I'm about ready to start breaking up laughing, because this is like something I've dealt with a lot, that I'm going to tell you, miscommunication is a major thing in law enforcement. I'm going to start off with that.
Yeah, well, not only miscommunication, but I mean, if you really want police, because you specifically as a private individual are worried about that person over there, for whatever reason, you don't like what that person's doing, or you're concerned about it, and you want police to come deal with it. Well, if you just say, well, I'm not really sure what he's doing. He's walking down the street with his cell phone in his hand, and he's like pointing it at cars, and just, no, he's just on the sidewalk. You're not going to get police response to that. I mean, that's a constitutionally, First Amendment constitutionally protected activity. He's in public, on a public, So how do you get police to show up? Well, you kind of maybe say, well, he's been trying some door handles. He's really been looking into the, you kind of exaggerate, I should say.
No, I would say fabricate.
Maybe. Yeah. I'm trying to be nice, but possibly completely fabricate things that they're doing. And we have video evidence of this now.
Right.
But like when you were a police officer, camera phones weren't really a thing. Did you ever get the idea that this was happening a lot? I mean, I understand the whole.
Yes, it happened with some degree of frequency, and I would say that, and I'm going to be very honest, in the area I worked was predominantly Latino. There was sometimes a racial component associated with it as well. Some of the business owners in town were of different ethnicities, and so they associated certain demographics with criminality. And so they would just, if a person of this ethnicity walked into their store of a certain age, they would call the police because they were getting ready to be robbed. Now, whether or not they had a history of being robbed and that sets off bells and whistles. And sometimes what you find out much later is there was some type of confrontation or something going on. But yes, misreporting was something we dealt with all the time. And I will say, to law enforcement's discredit, they often don't take action that they should, particularly when they know a false report has what meets the requirement. Okay, every state has different requirements on what constitutes false reporting, but in California at the time, again, I retired. They've changed the law since I retired. But when I was retired, before I retired, a 911 call that contained objectionably fallacious information, particularly if we knew it was fallacious, we could charge you with a crime, and frankly, we could arrest you. Was that the standard? No. Was it largely ignored by many jurisdictions? Absolutely, because there's issues with perceptions of law enforcement, right? Like, first of all, I don't want to call the cops if they're going to show up and arrest me. Sometimes maybe the cops should be arresting reporting parties at higher degrees than they currently do. But there's all this idea of community interaction and, getting along with the public. And not that that's bad, but typically the people that get ignored are those from the already targeted group for this type of, frankly, it's institutionally racialized. So, if you have a certain demographic that's being called upon, the police are getting called on at a higher rate than others, and you see that a certain demographics of reporting parties are consistently the ones doing this, and police aren't ignoring it, it's perpetuating the problem. And I'm not saying it's always an easy fix, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily an easy do, because there is quite often a cultural component as well. But it happened quite a bit where I worked, where there's these people of this age in my store wearing red hoodies, and so is that a crime? Absolutely not. But they're African American males, 16 to 21 years old. They're wearing red hoodies. They got to be in a gang, and they're obviously of a blood set in the area, because we had that just outside our city. We had mostly Crips and Hispanic gangs in my city, most cities that I worked. But if a blood set came into town, we would know that, right? And it was not an uncommon thing for gangs to commit street crime and armed robbery. So people tended to they would know the word on the street, so they'd be key to possibly overreact. And I call it overreaction because they either through a lack of knowledge, sometimes their own prejudice and biases, they were predisposed to assume the worst of people, and then and a law enforcement responds accordingly, because we're not getting the call of, hey, there's two 18-year-old African American males that are basically not buying anything in the store but haven't left yet and are wearing red hoodies. We don't just get that they're just loitering. We get that they're getting ready to attempt encasing for a burglary. And when the dispatch operator says, do you think they have a firearm? The answer is yes, I think they have a gun. So why? Again, there's these stereotypes, and I hate to say it, they're often perpetuated in popular media as well. And people get, socialized into these conceptions of other people. And it goes out in our community, and law enforcement is one of the people that are one of the professions dealing with it on a daily basis. And it is a extreme problem. And, you see it every day. I can't think of a day in my career it didn't happen at least once, where someone called on someone who didn't need to be called on, and it sounded much worse than it was.
And I guess I should make one step back, because one of the points I kind of wanted to make was the policing, especially currently, is an incredibly difficult job, because we've now devolved pretty much any problem that any citizen has is now the responsibility of the police to fix. So anytime anything doesn't go your way, or you're having any kinds of problem at all, the propensity is just call the police, let them deal with it. So, now we're expecting the police of America to fix all problems that you may have, whether it's rightly in the purview of actual law enforcement to fix it or not. So now we're calling police for everything. So we're getting a lot more police interactions. And so I just kind of want to go through some of the different issues that I've personally seen now that we have good video evidence of what's going on. And one of the things that I saw was issues with what was reported versus what was actually happening. You mentioned issues with going through how many dispatchers before the officer finally gets the information, and how much has that changed or what has been missed. Do you have any, what kinds of things could be done, do you think, to maybe simplify that or stop that, mitigate that problem?
Well, in a perfect world, if I had unlimited funds and I was the man that was placed in charge to fix this issue, first of all, I would give dispatch operators not only the ability, but I would make it, absent a few circumstances, that officers would be transferred in real time as they're en route to talk to the people before they get there.
Really?
But you can do it occasionally, like in tactical calls, we did it all the time, but if I was responding to, let's just say, a suspicious person, I want that officer talking to that reporting party on the way in, because that's going to give them a sense of what's going on. The officer, in my opinion, in my experience and research, is going to be able to process the information they receive from the reporting party in real time in a more objective way, being more, having an objective opinion. Before it gets there. So what are they doing? Well, they're standing in the store. Going back to the example that I mentioned earlier. Are they doing anything? Well, no, they just won't leave. Okay. And then the officer, even though it's come in originally as that colony probably there's 2 officers dispatched, right? The officers in real time can process that information of the reporting party and get information. Like, what are they doing? They're doing this. Have you told them that we're en route? Well, yeah. Did they leave? No, they said they aren't doing anything wrong. Again, this is all information that you may not get if the dispatcher is constantly having to relay this to, because in real time, what's happening is often the officers, while they're en route, are asking questions to dispatch. Ask the reporting party X, ask the reporting party Y. And again, when you start playing this telephone game, information slows down. It's passing through multiple people's perception and their own training, whether it's, one of the biggest problems I had, as occasionally I had to supervise dispatchers when I promoted and I was in a supervisor capacity, was explaining to them, like, keep asking questions. Don't just get the minimum information for the officer to respond to the call. Get more information. Like, keep asking what they're doing. Don't just, okay, officers en route, and then hang up. If calls weren't backing up, we need to keep those people on the line, because there's additional information coming out. We don't need, again, if they do anything different, call us back. I heard that more than once. And I took appropriate supervisory action. But this was a common problem in law enforcement, is there is this propensity for dispatchers to go through a predetermined script of information, which is sometimes very good. Some departments are very good at developing these, gaining information, but then the necessity of transferring that initial information onto the officer in real time, and then allowing the officer to, quote unquote, even before they've arrived on scene, start talking to the reporting party. And if there's multiple reporting parties, you'd have to prioritize which reporting party you're going to go into, because that happens as well. One thing that will happen is often in agencies, you'll have what I call operator overload. Something happens, you have 5 people call. Well, who gets screened? Who becomes the primary reporting party? Because a dispatcher can't, even if you have 2 on or 3 on, depending on the size of your agency, one operator can't process 5 people simultaneously. Even 2 operators would have a hard time, and dispatchers start triaging the calls coming in.
We saw a very good example of this at the bank shooting in Tennessee recently. Because there was like 6-7 different people who called, and they had all of those calls, recorded. So they did release all of those calls as well. And then it's like, okay, including the shooter's mother ended up calling to try and warn police that a friend of his is calling her to tell her that he's doing something bad. So she's calling the police. So you got a hell of a phone tree going on with that. And it's like, how do you prioritize? Because some of these people were in the bank witnessing this. One person was at a security station, saw all of this going down. Somebody was on a Zoom call, seeing all it. So it's like trying to get all of this information when you've got so many, especially if it's like a large event going on like this was. And
you'd always, again, I start thinking from a tactical standpoint, I'd want at least one, if not two people talking to officers as they're responding, whereas the suspect now, in real time, not being relayed through a dispatcher. Mm-hmm. Again, if it's 10 or 15 seconds late in a tactical setting, even let's just say, and that's the best case scenario in most cases, just so you know, 10 or 15 seconds, stuff can change dramatically from he's still in the bank till he's walking outside. But if we're getting that in real time, then again, I'm not going to tell you what a tactical situation would have been. It may have changed the outcome.
Yeah, well, in the case of the bank shooting, I'm suddenly drawing a blank on the name of the bank that it happened in. First National, I think, bank shooting. Had the first two responding officers, one who had been an officer, been on the job for, I think, 3 days, and he was out with a field training officer. They were the first two that actually showed up at the bank. Had they been able to be in contact with, especially a couple of the people who had access to cameras, where they possibly could have known where the shooter was, perhaps the officer of 3 days wouldn't have been shot in the head, because they would have known he was standing in the lobby, and they wouldn't have run right by those glass windows. So yeah, I can see the usefulness of that.
Well, I'm familiar. I've read. I don't want to comment. I mean, there was a lot of issues with that response. But yes, real-time information possibly could have changed things. And also, I'm going to give you this. This is another thing that law enforcement needs to reevaluate. Is I've seen more than once a scenario play out very much like the one that you just described, where a field training officer and I'm going to use terms that we used to use back in the day that we don't use anymore, his boot, his brand new, fresh, probationary officer is, we call them greenies for like the first few months, respond to a critical incident like that, and they're thrust in. I know that I've ordered officers to stand by with their trainee in certain tactical situations because I knew their trainee was not quite ready for it. Now, I'm not saying that this officer did anything wrong, but I think it's something that agencies need to consider. You have an officer who is literally out of the academy less than a week, and you're putting him in one of the most dynamic tactical situations with one other officer. That's a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. Now, you can order officers to stage. Running into the bank isn't necessarily always the best thing to do. And if you're in an active shooting scenario, then that's a different consideration. But that doesn't seem how they were actually responding to the incident. They were responding to an armed robbery.
Yeah, it was that one was a difficult one because they've got so much on film, and so you can see the entire timeline of things going on and what the officers were being told, what they knew. Right. Anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked on what.
No, I mean that will be, again. There are studies. You can go to the FBI. There's a universal crime reporting, and there's also studies that come out every year on law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. And you can read those reports, and then what happens is experts go through and find the strengths and weaknesses of tactical responses that result in officer fatalities. And often it's a lot more criticism than saying what they got right. And I have a feeling this is going to be one of those instances that has quite a bit of criticism assigned to it.
Now, when it comes to, again, with society deciding that every problem that it has is now going to rely on police to solve, that involves, giving police authority and authority for the use of lethal force. And there's quite a few people that, for lack of a better way of describing it, that kind of authority, that kind of power over other people gets to their head, and they end up gravitating towards abusing that power, getting an ego about it. What kinds of steps were taken to mitigate that when you were in, and do you think those were sufficient? And if they're not, what do you think should be done to try and mitigate that?
Well, most people are aware that, again, I can only talk about California, and the agencies in the states around where I work required a battery of psychological testing. Was it enough? Absolutely not. It's law enforcement's woefully underscreened in many ways. I mean, they know more about your tax history than they actually do about your psychological development. That's just the reality of it. You also select for certain personality types in law enforcement that may not be conducive to a community policing model if that's what you're going for. But cops, again, I came in just post Rodney King. Cops are still being selected, in my opinion, for the ability to be hyper aggressive. And that's probably what you're thinking of as being, cocky, arrogant. We'd call it badge heavy. That's the term that we typically describe it as. But the other problem is once you have an officer and they are now becoming progressively indoctrinated into the system of law enforcement, because it is a culture, you aren't spot checking your officers to the degree you should as far as where they are psychologically, how healthy are they, unless you've gone through a critical incident and then receive the proper counseling. And in my opinion, it's even when you think you've got enough, you need more. I would call it the standardized use of psychology as a resource in law enforcement is woefully ineffective. Yes, did we have peer counseling? Did we have a departmental psychologist? Yes, we had all those resources, and my department may have been better than most because we had a few people in our upper echelons who had been through critical incidents where they fought some demons afterwards, so to speak. So they put more money into the programs that some agencies didn't. But in my experience, it's lacking. Why aren't officers going? I mean, you got to qualify with your firearm. At least in my department, you had to qualify quarterly. We were considered zealots because we didn't do it semi-annually or annually. But why not have your officer go in and once a year sit down with the departmental psychologist and see where they're at, see whether or not they're still able to manage their stress and their authority appropriately. And that's something that if you did at least on an annual basis would mitigate a lot of problems, in my opinion. But again, unless there's a problem, and someone has to realize there's a problem before someone will react to it. And often that's not how law enforcement handles issues like this.
Yeah, again, the advent of the ability to video, everybody having a high definition video recorder in their pocket has really shed some light on some issues that may not have been widely known. Whereas
not
before,
not widely known to the public, but it was widely known to law enforcement. And until cell phone cameras, what you see in kind of like the worst excesses today were kind of standardized in law enforcement, 20, 30 years ago. I'm never going to apologize for law enforcement. But what I will tell you is that the only reason we're seeing some shifts in law enforcement is because of what I consider, the citizen observer element. I don't think you would be anywhere near this if cell phones didn't have cameras. And I still think we're at a very poor place in society. I mean, people, they hear about my previous career and they assume we come out being, banging the drum for law enforcement. And in certain situations I will, but most of the time I realize that as a institution, it's woefully lacking in many areas. One of them is how they engage with the public and how they perceive themselves in their role with the public.
So now we've kind of, I know that you haven't been a law enforcement officer for a while. And
Yep.
there's been a lot of things that have changed. So I am trying to bear that in mind. I'm just trying to, and that things have clearly improved at least a little bit in many areas. When you were out on patrol, how well did you actually know the law? Did you know most of the like the city ordinances? Was there a lot of training on what are the actual laws? When laws changed, or updated, which happens in some places very frequently. What was the training like on, essentially memorizing what the law actually is?
So I'm going to say it like this. I was sometimes called a nerd because I read the penal code and actually learned the law outside. I would call occasionally the DA. I'd go to training sometimes on my own dime for search and seizure stuff because I knew that if you wanted to promote in advance that stuff you needed to do, you need to pass certain tests in order to become a supervisor, right? Or you want to become a training officer. But most officers are trained to what I consider poor but uniform standard. They understand the elements of the big crimes that they'll be investigating. They understand like basic traffic laws enough to, do a fair job as a patrol officer. They know enough city ordinances to use them effectively, to give them, pretexts for stopping people and occasionally taking enforcement action, because that's often what city ordinances are used for, which is one of the problems with city ordinances. But most cops don't know anything beyond what someone could learn in 10 to 12 weeks. I think the average college student who does a pre-law degree has a vastly more extensive knowledge of the law and the Constitution, which is another issue entirely, than your average police officer. The average police officer, I would say they'd have a hard time even passing if they had to come out of the police academy and then take a test, they would have a problem passing second year college level law classes. Now, do they learn more in their career? Absolutely. You get additional training experience. So when you ask them that question, you have to say, like, what does the average cop know? And I would say, at what point in his career or her career? If someone's been a detective, I guarantee you in the areas they're investigating as a detective, they're much more nuanced and specialized in those areas of laws. Because I was on a warrant service unit, tactical team, I knew warrant law really well, because I had not only make my supervisors happy, I had to make, sometimes district attorneys, but the judge definitely, who was signing off on warrants, had to be happy with what we were doing. So you get specialized in certain areas, but the average officer in patrol who's only got a couple of years out on the street, so to speak, he or she is, in my opinion, not as prepared as society needs them to be. That's my answer.
And the reason I kind of asked that question is, again, watching many of the filmed interactions with police. Of course, this is selection bias, so I have to be very careful about this.
I guarantee it is.
Well, yeah, it's absolutely selection bias, because if nothing happens of interest on the interaction, they're not going to post it. So they're only posting the times where things get interesting or go wrong. So, but the sheer number of those that are out there is still concerning. So even if it is selection bias, the hundreds and hundreds of videos of cops that blatantly don't know the law, and then either are completely ignorant and they're just wrong, they believe something that isn't true, or they're lying about what the law actually is. Many of these are surrounding by ID laws. So that was one of the reasons I was kind of asking, because generally speaking, it's the patrol officer that most average citizens are going to run into first, and you would think that they would need a higher understanding, maybe not quite so specialized. If you're serving a lot of warrants, then yeah, you would need to really know warrant law very, very well. But a general patrol officer should know kind of fundamental basic things like, when are they authorized to demand ID and get it? And I've seen that. I've seen so many videos of police failing in that simple thing. The number that come out of Texas too, because Texas is an interesting one, that until you're actually placed under arrest, you are not required to identify yourself, and you cannot be arrested for failing to identify yourself. So,
and you understand that varies by jurisdiction, though.
Yes,
because
it does. That's why I said
states
Texas.
Actually have, yeah, right. So in Texas, there may be a constitutional challenge at the state level, right? But like Arizona, not too many states away, another very red state, there are state laws that require you to identify.
Yes,
and
the
so,
jurisdictions change.
Right, and so I will say that even in Texas, part of the issue right now is state laws versus county ordinances, because one of the issues you have in some of these, I'm going to call them auditor videos, is that a county can pass an ordinance for identification, right? So whether or not it's constitutional is a different issue. Because I don't think they necessarily are. But all an officer has to have is good faith when they don't have to have a perfect understanding of the law. And if they've been told that the county or the city has passed an ordinance requiring, upon detention, presentation of ID, they're acting in good faith. They're not required to have what's called detailed analytical knowledge of the law. They just know this is the law. It's come down from state government or city government or county government, and then they can take appropriate enforcement action. Texas is a weird one because they actually put it at the state level about the no requirement to ID, and it's gone through the Texas Supreme Court. And the reason you see so many videos is because that's kind of been a recently challenged thing. So the decisions that have come out, you have a lag time until a lot of this stuff catches up for law enforcement. And we used to get training bulletins every day, like, you can't do this now, or you can do this now, right? Like, hey guys, this court case has gone through the Ninth Circuit. Make some notes, guys and gals. This is for, and I'd put as a supervisor, I'd be throwing copies of these in people's boxes, saying you need to read the training update for today, and then or go over it in briefing or whatever. This is just common things. There's continuous training on this, but some agencies don't do that. Some agencies are operating with policy manuals that are archaic. Still citing cases that have been overturned, or using patrol tactics, as far as how they contact and interact with people that were based on case law from 20 years ago, or 25 or 30 or 40 years ago. There were many agencies that were still effectively doing stop and frisk, even though the law in many states and this in later, the Ninth Circuit had changed some of those rules. Cops just weren't being trained up to that level.
If I can interject for a second, because I've seen some of this footage, and for me, I grew up in the suburbs, and I knew some of the police officers in our area by name, and they walked around, they introduced themselves, they talked, and I thought this was police everywhere. So it was a bit of a shock to me to learn that this was a rarity in this country. But Isandering started introducing me to some of these videos, and we're going to do a show on this because some of the corruption that has been caught on these cameras has been absolutely staggering. Well, first, I find it shocking how many officers, and again, there's selection bias, so it's hard to tell, but there are officers who don't realize that when you if you turn your body cam off, then you turn it back on, it actually still has 30 seconds in the buffer. It has no audio, but the previous 30 seconds to before you turn it on is often still recorded. So we've got footage of officers planting marijuana or planting something and then turning their camera on, and then and I mean, you can literally just see he's got it in his hand, puts it there, turns his camera on. What's this? Oh, look what I just found. And you've got the 30 seconds beforehand. So you had said that you think cameras have dramatically changed how, I think this is what you were talking about, or at least this is part of what you were discussing, how cops approach these, well, let me rephrase that. So it seems like this, in your view, is getting better as a result that everybody's got a camera. Officers now have body cameras. How serious has the problem of, and in this particular case, apparently the officer thought, the breakdown appeared to be that the officer just wanted to hold the guy, and they hadn't found any drugs. They said, look, he'll be out by tonight. It was marijuana. It was New York. They figured nothing was going to happen. Turned out he actually already was on parole for a drug violation. So he ended up going back for 2 years. Turns out the previous one had been planted too. So this guy ended up spending 4 or 5 years when 2 officers planted a small amount of narcotics. How big a problem do you think this has been, and how quickly is it getting resolved, and what do we do to solve it even faster?
It's a problem that is considerable. I'm just going to tell you that you're going to hear, I call them cop apologists, come out and talk about how rare it is. It's probably not as rare as people think. You get, I'd call it departmental culture. Every department's a little different. Regions of the United States have kind of permutations often of the same cultural attitudes. Like I will say, New York cops and LA cops, we didn't like each other, but often we approach problems the same way. But in many ways, we were very different from cops from definitely Texas. But the South, we just typically we acted differently than they did. But in my experience, generationally, that kind of ends justify the means was a common trope in law enforcement. Again, and the internal reporting on it, in my opinion, was non-existent and resisted. So even in instances where officers reported misconduct, the ramifications, and I'm talking 30 years ago now, were very limited. You did the right thing and nothing happens. And so do you go to the district attorney's office? Is the district attorney going to do anything? probably not, to be honest with you, in my experience. Now, departments are highly reactive because they realize that they're under a much higher degree of scrutiny. But I don't think it's uniform. I don't think every agency approaches it this way. I think there's some agencies that are still operating under the standard from 30 years ago. And in my experience, officers that are going to be prone to misconduct learn to do their misconduct in a way within the new rules, right? This is just, they just adapt. Again, turning off your body camera. Like, explain to me why you need to turn it off. Oh, I want to have again, we just started having body cameras at the time I was coming. We had cameras in our cars with mics, but in a while we had, towards the end we had portable cameras. I needed to talk to the officer in confidence, right? About, and we had certain exceptions that were for legal reasons, by the way, like, district attorneys and state attorney generals telling us like when it's okay to turn off your mic and when should you. But then that becomes everybody's turning their body cam mic off in a certain agency under certain times, and they're having a high degree of narcotics arrests. Well, this is the issue. And what you're seeing is that officer wasn't, I know which case you're talking about, that officer wasn't, he didn't get caught. He was trying to adapt his quote unquote policing style, which again, was planting drugs and evidence on people, to the new standard of how he was going to use that recording as evidence. That's why he comes back on. If you remember, he's like, oh, wow, he acts real stupid surprised. It's like not the best acting job, by the way. But the truth is, he didn't change what he was doing. He changed how he was approaching what he did. And that's again, same thing with cops. Why do you hear cops talking in very monotone voice when they're using force? Stop resisting, because that's what you're trained in the academy to say. And hey, don't scream when you're saying it. Make sure you keep an even tone so that when people are listening, it sounds like you were in control. And that's true. It's a perception thing too. If you're calm, the public's calm. That you're taught that, right? If you radiate chaos as a police officer, guess what? It becomes more chaotic. So these are tools, but the same thing. It's about image, and so that's the issue. I mean, it's not a perfect world, and law enforcement is far from a perfect profession. Particularly, it's the application of pre-programmed responses and trying to make every square peg fit, or every square peg fit in a round hole in many cases, because you just don't have the options you need.
One of the
and just before we go on, Titan made a really good comment, because he and I have talked before. Our military's, our law enforcement's highly over militarized, and that's one of the issues.
Why I was going to get to that.
Yeah,
that was a question I have queued up to ask you about. But one of the other areas where we've seen explosions of videos being posted online is officer involved shootings, and the plethora of comments that we get about why did the police officer shoot this person. And many times it's like, well, he just had a knife, or he just had a stick, or he in some instances didn't have any weapons at all. He was in fact unarmed. There's one I'm thinking of. There's an Anchorage shooting at a wedding in Alaska, and it's like the body cam footage, the guy knocks one police officer out, hits him with his bare fist, knocks him completely out. Takes this guy like another 2.5 minutes to be able to get to his feet after this, and he attacks the other police officer. That police officer, after being knocked to the ground, ends up shooting him, and he unfortunately dies. And there was so many comments putting on there was like, well, these barbarian pigs have shot this unarmed person. I've seen many comments ridiculing police because, well, he just had a knife. Why didn't you just shoot him in the arm? Could you cover maybe a little bit of why people don't shoot to wound, or shoot to disarm, or shoot to just what is the training for when people use their firearms, when police officers use their firearms? I
usually ask the public, when I used to talk to the public, do citizens police academies where they come in and try to learn a little about what we do. One of the things I always ask them is like, our job as policemen, first of all, is protect the public, right? Property second, public first. So one of our big jobs is not shooting the public. The first rule, number one. Why don't we shoot body parts? Because most cops miss. police officers are trained to a very poor standard, in my opinion. As a firearms and tactical instructor, I will tell you that the average police officer may hit their target in a combat or, again, close quarter battle environment 50% of the time, and that would be good on average. So shot placement is a severe problem for law enforcement. So if you're going to add the additional component of precision shot work, that's what we call it, law enforcement's not skilled enough. So unless you're going to turn everybody into a military grade sniper, that's not going to work. So it's impractical, and it's highly unreasonable. I mean, again, I would take people through simunition training and say, okay, I'm gonna have a knife, you got to shoot me in the hand, try it, and they never can do it. And then they realize that's why cops don't try to shoot guns and knives out of people's hands, because even though if they consider themselves a very, I was in the Army, okay, shoot it out of my hand, but if you can't shoot it out of my hand, you get to die, or the person that I'm attacking gets to die in this scenario. And then people change their mind quickly. Second thing is we shoot center mass because that's the best way to have a bullet not go through someone, like an arm. There's nothing worse than shooting someone with a 9mm in their arm and watching it go through the other side and hit someone in the backdrop. Again, these are things that really happen, and they happen much more often than people want to admit, even in law enforcement. So we're taught to shoot center mass because hopefully the bullets won't go all the way through. It happens. Bullets go through people at normally large rates, but that's one of the other reasons we shoot center mass. If you've identified a threat and you're using lethal force, then you're using lethal force. You're not using your lethal weapon for less lethal option. And that's, again, this is a limitation on law enforcement. You only give law enforcement the average officer carries a few forms of equipment. Let's just run through what a cop carries on his duty belt. He or she is going to have a sidearm of whatever caliber that department issues, set of handcuffs, some type of chemical agent, probably pepper spray, but mace was also used for quite a while. I hate mace, but I like pepper spray. Some type of impact weapon. You carry an ASP, straight baton, PR-24, side handle baton is what a PR-24 is. Most agencies now issue officers tasers, right? But, tasers have their own problems and difficulties, and we've seen some of that already. Particularly, how do you carry it? How do you not confuse something that feels just like your firearm? Muscle memory issues.
And we've seen that just recently when the right. officer thought she had her taser and shouted, taser, 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 and in fact it was a loaded pistol.
Right. Yeah. And these are all issues, right? By the way, one of the original designers, or I should say, one of the original people that was a proponent of taser, thought it should look like just a square box. But many people in marketing said it needs to look like a gun to be threatening. But if it was just a box, there would be a different muscle memory attachment. And that's why some tasers still in other countries use a box design, is so that it changes how it's used and how it's deployed. That's just another side topic as a taser guy. But these are issues for law enforcement that people need to understand, is that, this is the options that officer goes in with: firearm, a taser, an impact weapon, and a chemical agent. Now you have to fix whatever problem you've run into with one of those four options. In addition, personal impact weapons, that's punching, kicking, and wrestling, right? Again, when I was in, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was like all the rage, right? So we were learning ground fighting, grappling, and various forms of, combat arts. But these are things that, some people stick up with it. We had quite a bit of training in my department in all those things. It's one of our what we were kind of known for. But some agencies, they may do annual training once a year. They go out, they fire their firearm. They may do a couple hours at the range trying to hone some skills that have really atrophied. They may practice with their batons for a couple hours. Like, that's it. And then, just get a taser refresher course, or they shoot a taser into a paper target once a year. And that may be the subs, after the academy, that may be the limit of their training. And some agencies don't even meet that requirement. So again, these are the challenges you're presenting to law enforcement as a profession. And so when someone shows up and they say, well, why'd they do X? I'm like, did they have the options to do X? Well, what do you mean? Like, does every officer have a taser? Well, no. So you can't judge that officer not having a taser. That agency, they don't have it. They may not have training. So that officer had two options. They had chemical agent and or firearm, and chemical agent requires you to close to a certain proximity with that suspect before you engage it, right? Should they have waited for another officer? Maybe. There's a whole set of standards and tactical awareness that goes into all this evaluation. And most people don't realize that it's, you're not there to not go home. You're expected to incur a certain amount of risk in law enforcement, but you're never expected to put yourself in a lethal position. Like, basically, yes, it's dangerous, and yes, you could die at any moment in some scenarios, but the odds are your entire job is to mitigate those both to yourself and the public.
But tasers stop people. They incapacitate them. Why aren't tasers used more often? But
they don't. So again, that's one of the misnomers. We see a lot of videos where tasers do work, but again, if you go to like Taser International, they talk about how awesome their taser, whatever the X model it is this year. I will tell you, I wouldn't want to be an officer in Detroit during the winter and have to deploy a taser, because clothing is the number one defeater of a taser. Second is, having, quote unquote, as we used to say, something else on board. Drugs and or alcohol are a big defeater of how effective a taser can be. Improper deployment. I hit you with one bar, but not two. So I get less than good contact. Some people have a natural resistance to the effect of the taser. There's been studies. Some people are immediately, and the majority of people, fortunately, immediately collapse when a taser is deployed. Others experience muscle rigidity, but the ability to still maintain muscular control. What do you mean? Yes, they're really, really mad now, but they're able to walk through a taser, even after multiple deployments, right? And the thing about a taser, it has a limited number of charge, and it's a battery, so it gets weaker. And you can hit, you can hit, you press the trigger once, you get a certain, measured dose. Sometimes it was 3 seconds, sometimes it's been 5 seconds, right? With a reset, right? Different versions of tasers had different time elements on them. But that's the other thing. You're asking an officer to maybe not deploy the most effective method. In a perfect world, if the taser would work, but it may not. And so in that scenario where someone has a knife and a single officer's on scene and they're pointing a gun at someone, the public may wonder, well, they have a taser, why aren't they pulling it out? Because there needs to be a lethal option there. The taser is not the best option. It may be the best option for effecting an arrest. It's not the best option for protecting the officer and the public. If the taser is ineffective and that's what the officer has in his hand or she has in her hand, then that becomes a potential lethality for the officer and or the public. So again, when the second officer gets there, you often see like, hey, I'm going to taser him, or I'm going to, or we're going to taser her. And then, taser. Again, why you say that is so hopefully no other cops hear the taser go off and think it's a firearm. But typically you don't, I'm curious, the videos where officers show up, walk up, immediately go to a taser and deploy it in a situation that they may be what we used to call being undergunned. And then, they're explaining to me, what's funny is the public's happy that they did that. But then I'm sitting back in the office and I'm going, can you explain to me why you walked up to this person in the winter who's wearing a heavy coat, was armed with a baseball bat, and then you approached them at taser range? By the way, tasers are pretty short, less than 20 feet. And why you decided to use your taser rather than maintaining your firearm on them until a second officer got there. That officer's going, I screwed up. As far as I'm concerned, as a supervisor, they could have handled that much better. So that, there's two different criteria. The public's all happy. The first scenario, the public's very unhappy. I'm happy because they followed the safest method both for the officer and the public, but not necessarily the suspect. And that's always a constant measuring balance and consideration in law enforcement. And I know people aren't going to like that answer, but yes, I've told many.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, so that was going to be my next question is well, why don't you just try the taser first? I mean, if it doesn't work, you still have a firearm. So yeah, I mean, you deploy a taser and it doesn't work, and you have to be within a certain proximity to them in order for the taser to even have a chance of being effective. And if it fails, well, now you're standing there holding a useless object in your hand.
And they're upset, and you have a limited reaction time too, right? Because I mean, the person now has been hit, but they can respond at that range and probably strike you within less than 3 seconds, that's not really enough time to pull out a weapon and fire it, I would. So anyway, you just answered. There had been an incident at Walmart where an officer had basically held someone at bay with a pistol until a second officer came, and then that officer attempted the taser. So what you're saying is basically the first officer becomes the
what
backup.
What happened is the second officer became the backup officer. They maintained their firearm, and the first officer transitioned to the taser, less lethal, and then taser. That's how it actually went down. But that's why it happened that way. It's because that's right in line with training.
So what do you think about officers who make a mistake? I know citizens, if they're in a self-defense encounter, they're held to a pretty high standard if they're going to fire their firearm. I've seen several videos where police have gotten caught up a bit. I mean, it's a pretty intense, adrenaline-fueled situation when you have somebody who possibly has a firearm. And one of the police officers will take a shot because, okay, this guy's got a gun, it's in his hand, and he's raising it up. So he makes a shot, and oftentimes you'll see many other police officers start shooting as well because one of their buddies has just started shooting this guy. And I've seen several instances where it's like one particularly egregious example where a guy, the second officer also shoots the suspect. The suspect was actually trying to throw his gun. Why in the hell he thought it was a good idea to pull the thing out of his waistband, raise it up to try and throw it over his head, I don't know. But the second officer starts shooting the suspect as well. And the suspect is standing in front of dozens of other civilians. He misses both his shots, and he ends up wounding 3 people that were standing behind him. How do you feel about when you make mistakes like that? Do the cops need to have their qualified immunity stripped from them and charged for these? I don't believe that he had any malicious intent. He made a mistake. Do you think that they should be charged for that?
Qualified immunity is kind of a interesting subject because I think it goes too far as it's currently constituted, particularly when you can show things like deficient training or even personal bias, right? Like there are things like past practice perpetuated should be a reason that qualified immunity is limited more than it is today. And there's certain instances where I'm going to give you an example that's not in the realm of shooting people, but a much more common variety of limited immunity that we have to look at is high-speed pursuits. We have officers that, male, female officers turn on their lights and siren and drive like bats out of hell to get to a call. They're trained not to overdrive. Lights and siren allow you to disregard certain laws, but it doesn't allow you to disregard public safety. But we have officers that have histories of multiple accidents, right? They're just basically they're driving too fast for conditions, and they have accidents. And occasionally one of those accidents results in fatality to the public. Now, in some cases that can't be avoided, and the officer has a record of being responsible driving in Code 3 conditions. And then other officers, hey, you stacked up a lot of cars. And did you receive remedial training? And why after this accident, which we know you overdrove, doing 70 to 30 even with lights and siren is never allowable, right? By most agency standards. Why wasn't this officer terminated? Should that officer have qualified immunity at that point? Well, I think we would have to, and I think the legal system, the courts need to say that in cases of flagrant disregard, then qualified, even at the department level, the department is the one that is making this determination that they're going to keep this officer on. And even though they've had this history of conduct, right, of irresponsibility or improper driving, however you want to call it, improper Code 3 responses, then maybe you should remove their qualified immunity. But in most cases, if an officer is operating in good faith, then qualified immunity should be maintained. But there are instances that qualified immunity, the standard, should be lowered based on totality of evidence and past conduct, both at the agency and at the officer level.
You think that's the appropriate place? The department looking at, if there's an accident, the department looking at the history, or should there be an outside agency that is not related to any of the police forces in the area that investigates that?
It definitely doesn't need to be the agency. Now, again, if you have a guy who backs up into or a girl that backs up into a telephone pole, that's a different accident than someone who's driving 70 in a 30 with lights and siren on and ends up just rolling a vehicle by themselves, right? This stuff happens all the way in law enforcement, by the way. You know, we crash more cars than we do anything else in law enforcement, at least in my experience. And these are issues that an outside agency should look at. Now, a public commission, I don't necessarily think that's the wrong way to go either. Citizen review board, if you want to call it that. I've seen those work really well. I've seen those not work at all, because in some cases, civilian review boards become effectively rubber stamps of police departments. I've seen sometimes independent district attorneys, having, depending if it's professional standards and other things, being able to review these instances as well. I do think that ultimately, if this is an issue for the court to weigh in on, and also state legislatures saying how do we want to regulate our department's use of various, you want to call it force, but various methods, right? Again, driving would be one of them. And how do we hold departments to standards so they maintain their qualified immunity? And what can departments do to lose their qualified immunity? And I think it's going to be a matter of case law. There's going to have to be more and more people challenging and overcoming qualified immunity, but legislatures and courts would be the first place for it to happen, where legislatures enact basically the bad practice rule, that a department, if they engage in bad practice and an officer who engages in bad practice, one and or both, then qualified immunity can be removed. Currently, that standard is so high, it's almost unassailable. Technically, there are legal exceptions, but they're very rare. That standard needs to come down to show that even just a general disregard is enough than a flagrant disregard, because a general disregard as a legal standard is very different. And again, we're getting into kind of nuances of the law, but this is for the attorneys and people crafting laws to really sit down and hammer out.
Do you think that lowering the qualified immunity and possibly terminating or prosecuting more officers for negligence, for mistakes that they made doing something unsafe, do you think that's going to create an even bigger problem with retaining police, recruiting new police officers, etc.? Every place that I've ever heard of, especially in a large city, is always short on police officers. Do you think it's going to have an impact on being able to maintain police levels?
No. I will tell you, cops are generally paid pretty well. You hear about recruiting problems typically because of the amount of money that goes into training a cop, not about recruitment. So there are applicants typically. Again, what departments sometimes talk about is problems with selection. Sure, there are issues sometimes with the standards. Those are pretty rare, though. Typically, what is the major bottleneck for departments hiring new personnel is the cost of training. The academy costs money, training an officer costs money, and so there's this monetary investment. And you have the chance, this is the other issue on the other side of law enforcement, is what I call negligent retention, is that we see a lot of agencies where someone should be fired, right? Like I, as a training officer, for example, make a recommendation to terminate an officer in training. The next training officer makes that same recommendation, but we really like this person and we think they should be given another shot, even though, or maybe they're just rubber stamped through. It happens at a much higher rate than people actually want to admit. So how does that not become a negative retention issue? Well, Pat's really hard on report writing, because I thought you should, as a cop, be able to actually articulate and document what you do. But then again, so other people may not have a functional knowledge of the law. But then again, Pat's kind of a stickler. He reads law books on his own time. He's just too hard on recruits, or in the academy and or trainees in the field. And you have other people that just, hey, you're my friend's brother's cousin, so I'm going to make sure we get you through training. That happens at higher rates than the public wants to admit. And I will tell you, the other issue is a lot of veterans should be screened out, because in training they have observable signs of PTSD that's picked up on by department personnel. But how are you going to tell a veteran that they don't have what it takes to be a police officer in Southeast Los Angeles in 2009 after 2 tours Afghanistan and 1 tour in Iraq? And I can't terminate anybody. That's the chief of police and the city manager's ultimate decision.
So looking at throughout your career and the issues that you saw with policing that you may have had a problem with versus looking at what's going on, I realize it's kind of an outside view now, with the issues with policing today, what do you think are some of the biggest problems today? What has gotten worse and what has gotten a lot better that you're encouraged about?
So I'll start off with the positives first, because that's a shorter list. I think public awareness of accountability is higher. More people are aware of what officers can do. Officers, and this varies by jurisdiction too, because I've seen some places they've done a really good job becoming public servants rather than administrators of the law. I mean, you know, I always call it the Judge Dredd mentality, right? We've moved further away from officers being a subset, a subculture of society, and reintegrating many of them back into society as just someone with a profession. I'm not saying it's done yet. I mean, there's still problems there, but I see movement in that direction. I think the generation of cops, particularly this current generation, again, we count generations in 10 years as cops. I was a cop of the 90s. The cops of the 2020s are a generation that are much more self-conscious of public perception. Whether or not that's good, or I think it's a net good, but they live in a hyper media observant environment, and they're aware of it, and so they're constantly vigilant to quote unquote do something as if it was on camera. That's good. I'd say 90% of the time. There are some times that I think that may cause them to act in ways like they're acting to a camera, whether or not they're handling the situation as it should be handled. I think there are some exceptions to that rule, but in general, I think that's a good rule, a good trend. And I also think that some departments, not all, but there are a few that have now adopted higher degrees of training. Some states are now moving towards a modular system of training that kind of parallels a associate's degree program. I'm not going to say all of them. Some agencies are offering it now, and they're treating the police academy more like college than boot camp. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some of that, but definitely if you want your cops to act like they're in the military, then you treat them like they're in the military. If you want your police officers to act like they're part of a community and that they're public servants and, you know, professionals in a wide variety of subject matter, not just, you know, the penal code and traffic law and use of force. If you want them to start knowing things about, sociology, how demographics, race relation, institutional racism, some basic training in psychology, and in some cases beyond just immediate first aid, then you need to treat it in a different way than just quote unquote a militarized police system. You need to make it more collegiate. Now there's a balance there, but I think we're shifting towards the balance where it needs to be versus the police academy in the 1970s, which is just, again, LAPD Police Academy was kind of a joke that was harder than boot camp for the Army at the time. They prided themselves on washing out more people than the Army did in boot camp. Physically.
So good things, what bad things?
Yeah.
Bad things is I think that law enforcement still remains a subculture. I think many of the, again, administrative elements in law enforcement are fundamentally rooted in a non-innovative mindset. I'm using little c conservative in their view. Basically, innovation absence mandate is never encouraged. If it ain't broke, we're not going to fix it. But we see the train wreck coming up ahead. Yeah, but if there's no train wreck today, innovation tends to lag very bad in law enforcement. Again, although a few places have opted a more collegiate model, that model is still woefully insufficient. We need to look towards not just Europe, but several European governments and the fact that they've treated law enforcement as a long-term profession with retention and training that is like a 4-year program. I'm not saying you got to go to college for all this. I mean, this can be done in a closed system, but the years of training that you make someone undertake before they become an officer in the field needs to be expanded. When I went through, my academy was excessive in the 90s, and we were told, man, I can't believe you have to go to the police academy for 20 weeks. 20 weeks. And after 20 weeks, I was turned loose on the world with a badge and a gun. And there were agencies still at the time in California that were still doing 12 weeks. And then there became a state mandate 16. There are some states in the United States that are still like 12 weeks, and you can become a law enforcement officer. I don't know how you learn anything in 12 weeks in order to have the amount of power and authority that a law enforcement officer has. If we're talking, we want to make it a serious commitment to law enforcement, it's a 2 or 4 year program at minimum. That's in my opinion, that's how you go. And you make it about, not everybody's cut out to be a cop either. A lot of people go to medical school. First thing they tell you in medical school is if you're there, is they say, look to your right and look to your left, because those people will not be here when you finish and you can call yourself a doctor. Law enforcement should have a similar attitude, that we gauge for success rather than mediocrity. Law enforcement, hopefully the medical profession is an example of where they're continually trying to raise the bar. Doesn't always work. But law enforcement sets, in my opinion, a pretty low bar across a variety of issues, because as long as they keep the bar a level bar, they're not encouraged to innovate. And innovation challenges the status quo. And the status quo, for many people, find that very comforting. I will tell you that there's demographic parts of this country that don't think law enforcement's brutal enough. I mean, there's another side to this as well. There is a significant portion of the population that think the police aren't shooting enough people. They aren't beating enough people. They aren't throwing enough people in prison. So law enforcement in jurisdictions often represent both the demographic and, I don't want to call it political, but that's what it comes down to, the political conventions of the societies and the communities that they are constituted in as well. Sometimes they don't reflect it at all, but that tends to be largely in urban centers.
I think Nick had some questions.
Yeah, I think I only have one major question left. I think it's already been covered, but I wanted to discuss it a bit more. And sort of along the lines of, how do you fix the problem? Now, you've obviously heard about Cop City in Chicago. We covered that for a while. A lot of problems associated with that, not least of which is who's funding it and what ostensibly the goals are. But we've also heard a number of communities have, and this is interesting too, saying, well, we should send less money to, say, Ukraine, and more military equipment to our police. And as you had said, there are definitely jurisdictions that think that they need military-grade vehicles and much more impressive firepower. Are there any jurisdictions where you think that is necessary or a good idea? And if that isn't the way to fix the problem, what is the way to fix the problem?
My short answer, and again, this is coming back from my time as, I taught tactics, and I was part of a tactical unit. So we are over-militarized our police. Now, part of that is a response to things we've seen in our society. So I will tell you, the reason every officer in the United States now, or not every, but most, carry an AR, isn't because that, and the public doesn't maybe not remember, but it was the North Hollywood shooting. Again, I was a young police officer. I wasn't. I just heard it. It wasn't my shooting. It wasn't my city, but that changed law enforcement. Now we have suspects armed in body armor. We need weapons that will punch through body armor. And then we decided to give every department a long gun of appropriate caliber to defeat most available body armors that the public can get their hands on. Doesn't defeat military grade, but again, that's a different issue as well. And so, initially, it seemed as a response that was good. Hey, we're going to give cops more tools. But then how were those tools being perceived by the public? We militarized. Okay, now you have to send your officers through rifle school and then rifle tactical training. And again, you're putting the tactic side really important because of this very rare scenario. North Hollywood shooting was a very rare scenario. But we have issues in the United States. This is the other side of it. The more militarized your public is, the more militarized the police have to be. And for those Second Amendment purists, if you don't want your cops armed better than you, then you have to make sure your public isn't armed better than your law enforcement. And right now, there's a constant ebb and flow. The reason police are driving around in Humvees and they want to have armored cars, again, I think it's because they want to look really cool is one of the issues. But the other reason is because there is a scenario that's realistic where they're going to have to respond to a situation where the public outarms them. And, again, the average, in some states, it's okay and it's legal to own weapons that law enforcement has no response for. It's military grade hardware. The only reason you need a 50 caliber rifle, right? These are realities of the country we live in, is to shoot through cars. That's it. And to defeat all available body armor. There's no body armor currently available that any law enforcement officer can wear that will protect them against a 50 caliber rifle.
Yeah.
So now there has to be a scenario. What do we do if we run up against someone with a 50 caliber? Well, now we have to have a urban assault vehicle that will stop 50 caliber rounds. Now your police department looks like a military. It doesn't look like a police department. So I am a proponent for. I'm not a Second Amendment absolutist. I definitely believe there needs to be comprehensive gun reform and legislation that limits, in some ways, the accessibility of the public to the most decisive and most militarized form of firearms. Again, I'm not saying that you can't own an AR, but if you're going to want the public to own an AR, then don't get upset that the cops carry ARs. That's just the reality of it. And some people go, well, I don't want the police militarized. Well, then you have a militarized public. So it's not going to come out.
So if militarizing the public is not, militarizing the cops is not, and do you have any specific view on Cop City?
I don't. I think what we're seeing there is very reminiscent of what we saw in New Jersey in the 90s with New York PD. We're seeing places where enclaves occur of certain cop conduct, of certain attitudes of law enforcement. And I think, again, when you can't, so I'm just giving you an example. You work in Southeast Los Angeles and you don't speak Spanish, that's a you problem. I used to tell my young trainees, I'm like, do you speak Spanish? They look at me and they go, obviously he doesn't, but I did. I'd say, look, if you don't speak Spanish, you might want to go to another department. Well, why should I speak Spanish? Because it's going to save your life and it may save someone in the public's life, right? Like your inability to communicate in one of the predominant languages spoke here by at least 50% of the public as their primary language is demonstrable of your ineffectiveness in this job. But then you have other purists that will say, well, we can't mandate an officer to learn Spanish. Well, unless they work for the Border Patrol. It's kind of interesting. They can in that instance. But then you have legislative requirements that say, like, hey, Pat, by the way, I heard you kind of rode your trainee down because he wasn't willing to learn any Spanish. And I'm saying, yeah, I wanted to send them to basic Spanish school. Well, you can't make them go. Why can't I? They're ineffective in their job till they learn to communicate with the populace that we're engaging with. And I was the bleeding heart liberal in law enforcement, even back then, because I thought every officer in our department should have to go through basic Spanish. But, and I was like the only Democrat in the department. So, I mean, my views have greatly shifted left since retirement. I was centrist, and centrist was very left as far as law enforcement. That's the other thing too. Law enforcement skews right hard politically and ideologically, and anybody who is not aware of that, you just have to go to a police department union or association meeting and poll them, and they've done it. And while all cops are in a union, many of them don't believe in anything other than a very conservative ideology, and that is problematic as well.
So a congressman who's the head of a major committee who has been tasked with fixing this comes up to you and says, okay, what do I do? How do I fix it? What do you think I should do? What do you tell him?
Again, you're going to have to, it starts at screening. And I don't think it's so much about making sure that your applicant hasn't smoked pot a couple of times, which again used to be a way to screen out certain demographics, it was like, well, let's make sure that we don't have any people from certain demographics getting in. So we'll make sure that if you've done X, you can't get in. That was very common, by the way, when marijuana was the bottleneck for many agencies. What's funny, a lot of Caucasian applicants could get an exception to that rule if it had been so many years since their last usage, right? The other issue would be the psychological component. The screening process for psychology and the psychological profession behind law enforcement needs to be extremely more robust. I don't think you should just have to go through one psychological evaluation before you're hired. You should have to go through like 3. And I want to know how come department psychologists aren't meeting with your wife if you're married, if you're male, or your spouse if you're just with someone. Why is it just a background investigator, someone who may be already predetermined that they want you as a cop? Why isn't your family unit being inspected if you are married? I'm not saying that should be a deciding factor, but let's interview your family. Let the psychologist talk to your parents, and your parents might say, I love my son or daughter, but they shouldn't be a cop. And maybe that's something departments should listen to. But hey, I passed the psychologist, the psychological screening. Psychologist says I'm fine. I will tell you, it's not a very high standard. They're looking for aberrant behavior. You take 1 or 2 written bubble-in tests, the MMPI. You do a 1-hour oral interview, and someone's decided whether or not if you meet the minimum standard, not an elevated standard, to become a police officer. And that just drives me nuts.
So actually, this is going to be my last question. Your channel is Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger. You get out of the police force and you decide you're going to start studying ancient history. You're going for a PhD in the subject. What the hell? What got you interested in that? And what are you doing now?
Well, when I first left law enforcement, I looked at law school. I actually went to law school for a couple of years. Ended up becoming in California something known as an LDA, legal document administrator, because I was going to stay in law enforcement adjacent. I was going to work as a legal investigator, but I realized I didn't like law enforcement as a profession. I didn't like kind of where it was going, and I wanted to do something for me. And my wife said, "Hey, look, you're retired, so do what you want this time." And so, again, history and archaeology is where I ended up because I love the subjects. I have a passion for it, kind of the same passion I had back when I was in my mid-20s becoming a cop, right? My first couple years on the job. But I don't, I'm not responsible for the safety of the public. I'm not having my daily interactions measured in the public sphere anymore. I do teach. I'm a college professor. So I just love this job, and I think learning the anthropology and the sociology that I've gained background in these subjects as archaeology being a subdiscipline of anthropology, I'm a better prepared candidate today than I ever was, even though I was a college graduate at 22, 23 years old. That it's just I think everybody should have a sociology or criminal justice should be a discipline that is heavily into the social sciences, not just legal theory and legal practice.
Well, and I've seen you stream with Dr. Joshua Bowen, and watching the two of you together has always been a delight. He, holy smoke, he speaks like ancient Assyrian and all these. It's amazing to be able to discuss those topics and do it interestingly. So, thank you so much for joining us. Did you have any final thoughts or anything else you wanted to say before we head out?
Yeah, last comment. I'm not some angel. I'm not going to say that I was a model officer at every point in my career. I think some people in the comments are right. Everybody knows a cop. Everybody knows a cop. Everybody knows someone either in your family, a friend, or a neighbor. Don't assume the way they act with you at home or at that barbecue once every 6 months where the neighbors all get together, that's how they are when they're a cop. They have the same failings every human has. Every cop has good days, bad days. Some cops go out to have bad days, but even generally decent people have bad days, and how they react to those stressors of a bad day for a variety of things, is an issue. You may come upon an officer who's he or she is I'm going to call him a good egg, but if they're having a bad day, you're the person dealing with that encounter, and just don't always assume that officers have to act a certain way based on your public perception, because there's always additional factors. There's always something else going on. And I would just say, my advice to people is, don't assume you're always in the right. Be respectful and understand that whoever this officer is, he or she has probably been front loaded with a lot of information where you become the subject of potential ire. So what you can do to mitigate that is often as important as protecting your own rights. Just like yelling. Again, little things like that can go a long way for people.
And whether you should have to or not, I've encountered police officers before who were absolutely 100% in the wrong, and I always call them sir, and I always say yes sir, no sir, and I stay out of it and save it for either court later or whatever, because proving who's right and wrong right then and there with somebody who's armed, chances are you're going to be fine, but all it takes is hitting the wrong guy at the wrong time. It isn't worth it. So yeah. Xandring, did you have any final thoughts, questions, anything you want to say before we go?
I do have one final question. I would like to thank you very much for coming on and talking with us about this.
You're welcome.
It's a subject near and dear to my heart. So thank you so much for coming on to talk with us candidly. My final question may seem a little weird, but just bear with me.
Sure.
I ask any police officer, former or current, I always try and ask this question. When you were a police officer, how upset would you be if I tried to pick you up and carry you around with me?
I'd be pretty upset. It probably wouldn't happen.
All right. Well, thank you.
Oh, come on. So, Xandring and I debate the Second Amendment every now and then, and Xandring has come up with two trite may not be the word I'm looking for, but very interesting phrases.
No,
and one of them is when every second counts, the police are just minutes away, which is an interesting and fair point when you're talking about the Second Amendment. And the second one is I carry a firearm because, well, I try to carry the police officers, but none of them like it when I carry them around with me. So, yeah, may have been a dig at little anti-Second Amendment me there going on, but
well, I would only retort with this, and maybe this can be a discussion at a future time. Why don't we take some time to repair on the number of good guys with guns who kill people for unjustified or less than justified reasons? Because one thing I think that is often overlooked in firearms-related homicides and or ADWs, assault with deadly weapons, is the imperfect defense exception. Many people aren't tried for murder when they shoot someone, when they don't have legal justification. They're charged with a lesser degree, basically attempted manslaughter, because they did an inappropriate level of defense as a civilian. I do think that's an interesting topic, but it'd be an interesting topic to decide how often are good guys with guns, and I want to use that term because that seems to be really popular in the media nowadays, how often are they committing what effectively becomes extrajudicial killings and or maimings that are not being looked at? Because I guarantee for every one on the news, there are many more that aren't being reported because of various instances and lack of media exposure. How many times does a good guy with a gun, brandish it, commit, we call it brandishing in California, but how often does some good guy with a gun point a gun at someone when they really have no legal or justification to do so? Get off my property, kid. That happens at a higher rate than many people want to admit. And maybe that's why people are nervous about people walking around with firearms at ready access, because in the United States, it appears many portions of our populace are willing to use them as tools for mitigating any and all types of encounter.
Oh, I definitely think, and I already know, and just to be fair, I would suspect as Xandring's counter that would be also that there are times when a gun was used in self-defense that also aren't recorded. I think the three of us could have a spectacular discussion on this. And it's been a topic that's been going on for like 2 years on In Time between Xandring and I, and he's a delight to talk to about it and has taught me a lot. So we will let's bring you back and have that discussion. I think that would be a great one. Thank you, Pat, once again for coming on. We really appreciate it.
No problem.
Xandring, good to see you. And we will have, Xandring and I will be doing Downtime Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern. We'll be going a little early, and Commander McMillan will probably not be joining us for that. And then we're going to have a delightful show on Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Operator Starsky and Georgie from Ukraine Matters is going to be on, and it's going to be a call-in show. So you can call in, you can ask them, you can ask Commander McMillan a question, you can ask me a question, but I have no illusions that nobody's going to be calling in to talk to me. So Operator Starsky and Georgie from Ukraine Matters call-in show on Friday. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you guys will join us for that. And then on Tuesday, another special show. I keep wanting to say Brigadier General. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of all NATO ground forces and former U.S. commander of all U.S. forces in Europe, will be joining us to discuss what's going on in Ukraine, NATO's response, and the future of Ukraine, Russia, and of NATO. I think it is going to be an excellent show. We are very much looking forward to that. So, yeah, spit it out. I'm having trouble forming words today, or at least cogent sentences. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday for Downtime, and that will be on our sister channel, Overtime, and then for Operator Starsky and Ukraine Matters on Friday, and Lieutenant General Benjamin Hodges on Tuesday. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you then. Good night.
Good night.